Hi everyone, I hope all of you are doing okay these days. Today let's talk about external DNS. So what is external DNS? External DNS is a Kubernetes add-on that you can install in your cluster to manage the DNS entries that needs to be configured in an external DNS provider. So normally what we do is that we take the entry which needs to be updated in the external DNS provider and manually update it in the provider. So this is easy to be done in a small cluster which has one or two services or one or two ingress controls. But in a big environment where you have multiple services exports worldwide and which you need multiple DNS entries from the public to point into a cluster, you cannot do it manually anymore. So in that case, you can use the external DNS to overcome that manual overhead in managing external DNS entries pointing to a Kubernetes cluster. As you can see, there are a lot more DNS providers supported by the external DNS. For example, AWS Route 53, AWS Cloud Map, Azure DNS, Cloudflare, Google DNS, DigitalOcean, etc. In the external DNS GitHub page, you can find generally required files that need to deploy external DNS in your Kubernetes cluster. It gives the general configuration that you need to follow with basic and minimal configuration so you can easily deploy it to the cluster and test it out. But that particular basic configurations that is provided by the documentation examples in here will not be the best one that you have to use in your configuring it or deploying it in a production environment. So as you might know, I am a more towards AWS person. So I will go to the AWS section in here and let's see what are the example files that are provided from the external DNS GitHub page itself. So as you can see, even the IAM policies are provided by this example itself. Creation of the service accounts, namespaces, everything is provided in here. But this may not, as I said, these are general configurations, not the least privileged configurations or best practices that you need to follow when you deploy it in your production environment. In the external DNS, you can configure your external DNS only to consider specific type of entities. As you know, we have multiple entity types that we can use in order to expose a particular service the outside of Kubernetes, such as Kubernetes services, ingresses, endpoints, etc. So in this particular example, so this is the external DNS deployment that you will be deploying it in your Kubernetes cluster. And in this particular example, it looks for Kubernetes services and Kubernetes ingresses. And in this particular example, it only looks for Kubernetes ingress type. In this example, which is on screen, when you create a Kubernetes ingress, you get a host name in the cluster, inside the cluster itself, right? But from the backend, if you have installed AWS load balancer controller, it will create a load balancer. And in the load balancer, you get a DNS provided by the AWS itself for the load balancer. So what you need to do is you need to have the DNS that you want, which is defined in the host field in the ingress in the Kubernetes file, and the DNS provider for the load balancer by the AWS to be mapped with each other, right? So now you might be doing it manually. So when you deploy the external DNS, what it does is it reconcile and do that particular mapping for you in your chosen DNS provider. In this particular example, it has used AWS as the DNS provider. What it does is, for this particular example, it is using Route 53. It checks the DNS provided by the AWS, the default DNS provided by the AWS for the load balancer, and the host field value in your ingress YAML file, and do the mapping and create the mapping in the Route 53. So now you don't have to worry about, okay, I need to go and manually create that DNS record in my Route 53 host zone. Using the external DNS, we can use multiple DNS providers as I saw you in the first page. And again, you can use the same hosted zone. In here, we are using an hosted zone. So you can use the same hosted zone with multiple clusters with multiple external DNS providers. In that case, how the specific external DNS in the specific cluster identified whether which record is mine is using this registry entries. So by default, when an external DNS add-on create a record in your DNS provider, it creates 2 other additional records to keep the metadata or the ownership details of that particular record. So by default, it is created in the DNS provider itself. This is not one of the best methods, but this is the default method. Some problems that you might face because of this particular method is like your DNS provider can get cluttered, because every one entry there are 2 additional. So altogether there will be 3 entries created, right? Your DNS provider can get cluttered. Same time, you can increase some additional cost based on the pricing model of your DNS provider. So external DNS add-on has provided you some additional methods that you can save or store this metadata of ownership for particular entry. So by default, it uses txt method, which saves the metadata in the provider. Apart from that one, you can store the data in DynamoDB, AWS DynamoDB, or you can drop the metadata or the ownership details, or you can store the metadata in AWS Service Discovery. Dropping the metadata or the ownership details will be good if you are not sharing your hosted provider or the DNS provider with multiple clusters which has separate external DNS add-ons. But if you are sharing your DNS provider or the hosted zone, AWS hosted zone, with multiple external DNS add-ons, you should not drop the ownership details, because it can create issues or the reconciliation issues in the future. So in today's video, I just wanted to show you guys this particular option and give you an overall insight. So in my next video, we'll dive deep into hands-on and let's play around with external DNS. So I will create few separate videos for specific scenarios, and I will add all those videos to a playlist named as external DNS so you can easily follow. So if you have learned something new, please share this particular video with others and subscribe to my channel for future content. Stay tuned.